Swanson from Renaissance BioScience. Good talk to us today. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
So now that we're getting into springtime, it's Saison season. So I'm going to do a talk on Saccharomyces Cerevisiae subspecies Diastaticus.
Is it tight? Cool.
And the dreaded overpressurization of your finished beer. So a little bit about who we are. We're a yeast innovation company that operates in Vancouver. Our line of craft brewers yeast that's going to be coming out this year is under the brand name Bright. I think when I did the talk before, I bring some of our cider yeast, and that's under the brand name Renaissance yeast. I don't know who had a chance to try that. We don't have any beer strains right now, but hopefully the next time we do a talk, it'll be Scott, our brewer, that comes to do it, and he'll be able to bring some samples of the dry yeast for you guys. So how many, by show of hands, have had problems with either gushing or to the dreaded bottle bombs?
Give your hands up.
Yeah.
You're probably the only one.
Okay.
It's a pretty common problem.
I'm still finding the glass.
Also, so American ale, English ale, and then saisons that just kind of seem to go on forever and never really stop attenuating. You can let them go forever. This one, we finished at day 20, and it was still no signs of stopping. It just kind of kept going. So this is due to Saccharomyces Cerevisiae, subspecies or variety Diastaticus. It's a natural variant of Saccharomyces, but it has the ability to produce an exoenzyme called glucoamylase, which hydrolyzes the dextrins in your malt into fermentable glucose. There's many commercially available versions of Diastaticus. Virtually all saisons are Diastaticus. A lot of Belgian, what they call dry Belgians, are going to be Diastaticus. Quite a few distiller strains. A few of the wheat beer strains are even Diastaticus. The occasional high gravity brewer strain, and virtually all wild Saccharomyces. Most yeast suppliers have started indicating on their labels, due to some lawsuits that are going on right now with other yeast companies. They started indicating on their labels which of their yeasts are variation Diastaticus. So technically they're just regular brewer strains. There's nothing scary about them. You can treat them like a regular brewer strain. It's just they do have this enzyme capability, so they start labeling them Diastaticus. So definitely always review your technical data sheets and sales sheets before you brew with a new strain, and just still always say what species it is. And if it says Diastaticus, you can expect some of the things we're about to talk about. So let's take a step back, and in order to understand what Diastaticus is and how it operates, let's talk about what happens during mashing. So when you're mashing, you're activating some of the barley enzymes, namely alpha amylase and beta amylase. Alpha amylase is known as your liquefaction enzyme. It's an endoenzyme, so it'll come in to your starches and make random cuts at 1/6 linkages. And it'll start breaking the big, long starches into smaller pieces. And then you have your beta amylases, which is known as a saccharification enzyme, and that's the one that's mainly responsible for giving you your brewing sugars, maltose. After your mashing, you end up with a proportion of different brewing sugars. Anything that's 3 glucose units is called maltotriose. Anything that's 2 glucose units is maltose, and this is the highest proportion in your mash. And then you also get these unfermentable side chain branched units that are called dextrins. Typically, these are unfermentable by normal brewer's yeast, and this is what the Diastaticus is going to act upon. And you also get a really small proportion of glucose units. So this is just kind of reviewing what I just talked about. So your beta amylase comes in and goes after the 1,4 linkages, and it'll cleave off 2 units, and that gives you your maltose. Limit dextrinase is the first enzyme that is deactivated when you're mashing. It's not very heat or thermal tolerant, but it's really interesting in that it has debranching activity. All the other enzymes are very limited in what they can do. They just kind of chop off little chunks at the end of the starches, whereas limit dextrinase can actually debranch. But again, it's deactivated very early on in your mashing. And then alpha amylase, which is the most thermotolerant, but it doesn't actually give you a lot of sugar itself. It is more of, like I said, like a liquefaction enzyme. It just kind of makes big chops. But this is the one that will give you a lot of dextrin activity, or a lot of dextrins.
Sorry, and that's why I don't know if people are aware, if you want like a really full body beer, because it's so tolerant, mash higher, you get more dextrins and more in your final product for fuller body.
And then something that is not found in malt really itself is glucoamylase, and this is the enzyme that Diastaticus makes. A lot of these, or a lot of brewing supply places will also sell GMO versions of glucoamylase made by bacteria for doing brute IPAs and things like that. But it goes in, and it only has the ability to cleave off 1 glucose unit on the non-reducing end of starches, and it'll give you a glucose unit. So now that you've done your mashing, you get your wort. This is the rough breakdown of the different carbohydrates. Yeast consume them in really a specific sequence based on how much energy is required by the cell to take them in. So the easiest, as you can imagine, would be glucose, because it's just one small little unit. It also is around 20% of your mash, or 10%. Then maltotriose is going to be around 15%. Your dextrins incorporate about 20% of your wort, and then the highest proportion of your wort is going to be maltose, just 50%. So the reason glucose is the easiest for the yeast to consume is that it can pass over the yeast cell wall and membrane passively. It requires no transport capability from the yeast. The next is going to be maltose. It's only 2 glucose units. It does require active transport, but it's fairly easy for the cell to bring it in. Once it's in the cell, then it breaks it into its 2 single glucose units and metabolizes it. The next is going to be maltotriose. Those are 3 glucose units. It's a little bit bigger, it's a little bit harder for the yeast to consume, and it requires active transport. And then dextrins, most yeast will not consume them because they're very large and they have a branch on them, except our friend Diastaticus actually contains the glucoamylase, and it's able to cleave it and liberate these little glucose units. This is just a figure showing what I was talking about. Maltose is, you need this permease enzyme in order to bring it into the cell. Same with maltotriose, but because it's 3 units, it's even less efficient at bringing it in. Glucose is the easiest, it's passive transport. And then dextrin and sucrose both require the yeast to generate an enzyme, transport it outside the cell. The enzyme works, and then they bring in the glucose passively. So out of all of them, sucrose and dextrins are the hardest for yeast to metabolize. So now you've made your wort, you've added your yeast. Let's talk about the actual carbohydrate utilization of yeast. So standard yeast can basically consume 100% of fructose. Fructose technically is in wort. It's at almost negligible levels, like 2.5 to 5%, but it will metabolize 100%. If you do any fruit fermentations or add any fruit to your beer, the main sugar in fruit is going to be fructose. Sucrose, table sugar. Most yeasts will consume 100% if given time. Again, yeast have to, it's hard for them to metabolize the sugar because they have to generate an enzyme, transport that enzyme out of the cell. It breaks the sucrose down into the 2 sugars, and then it'll uptake those 2 sugars. So if you brew any like IPAs or doubles or anything where you're adding table sugar, just consider that. You're going to be making your yeast work a little harder, so give it a little bit extra time, a little bit extra love. Glucose, again, only about 10% of your work, very, very readily edible by the yeast. Maltose, very edible again, it's the highest proportion, around 50%. Now we get into maltotriose. So it can range anywhere from 0 to 100% usage. English strains generally are on the lower end, and any American, Belgian, Diastaticus is going to be 100%. And then dextrins, generally regular Brewsies, 0%. So we talked about yeast will consume maltotriose at varying amounts. Maltotriose is the main factor for determining your attenuation levels. Technically, yeast will consume all the sugars in your wort. It's the maltotriose that will dictate the difference between 65, 70, 75, 80. English strains are known to be low users, and it's this maltotriose that will give your beer a round mouthfeel and feel in the body. The bulk of residual carbohydrates in your beer are the unfermentable dextrins. They don't contribute much sweetness. Technically, the sweetness that you do perceive is actually, you can contain a little bit of amylase in your saliva. So when you consume the dextrins, the sweetness that you're getting in your mouth is actually the enzymes in your spit. I think that's pretty cool. Yeah. They make a huge contribution to your perceived body. It's the main kind of body towards beer, along with the maltotriose. So let's talk about relative sweetness. So if you have all these sugars in your beer, why doesn't it taste sweet? It's because there's different perceived sweetness levels to different sugars. So assuming sucrose or table sugar at a standard of 100, fructose, or the main sugar in a lot of fruit, is more sweet than sucrose. It's 130%. Glucose is actually only 70% as sweet as sucrose. Maltose is about half as sweet as table sugar. And now we get down into your maltotriose and dextrins. So maltotriose is actually only about a quarter as sweet as sucrose, and dextrins 15%. So due to their low relative sweetness, you can have a beer that has these residual sugars, but it doesn't taste sweet. It just kind of has a nice round mouthfeel.
I have a question. Let's say I didn't say here was dextrose, which is a common.
Dextrose is glucose.
Glucose.
Yeah, it's the same,
Yeah.
just different acronyms for the same thing. So how do these differences in carbohydrates translate into individual carbohydrates? So in our lab, we have the benefit of, we have a really nice analytical chemistry suite. We're actually able to give them a sample of beer, and they can break it down into individual carbohydrates for us. So if you've ever wondered why your saisons just kind of drag on forever like this, what is actually going on with the yeast? Let's break it down. So this is actually an example of a fermentation that Scott did last month. So thanks, Scott. So it's not maltose is not causing this slow, steady decrease that goes to eternity, because basically the difference between a saison yeast, the American ale, and the English ale, they consume it at different rates, but it's all dry and it's very steady. Although attenuated to different levels, it's not maltotriose either. So this is your English strain, and it's showing that it's got about 15 grams per liter, about 12.5 grams per liter left. But it's very stable. It's not showing that kind of constant, steady decrease. Bingo, it's, as we suspected, it's dextrins. So your American ale and English ale, your standard brewing yeast, can't consume any dextrins, whereas your saison is showing this steady decrease. This is 20 days when Scott stopped the fermentation, and it showed no signs of stopping. It was just continually chugging along, and this is at 21 degrees room temperature at about 30 grams per liter starting dextrose. And you can kind of see here actually, it took a few days before the dextrin started going down. And this is called catabolite repression. And in the presence of glucose or some of these other simple brewing sugars, the dextrin won't be metabolized by the yeast because it has easier glucose and other brewing sugars. Once those brewing sugars drop to a certain level, then the yeast will kick on its enzyme activity because it's starving, and then it'll start going down. So you could technically, if you had a really high gravity beer, it could be fermenting for 10, 15 days before you start seeing this dextrin start going down. So what happened to this beer after we packaged it? So we took the beer and we force aged it at 35 degrees. So this is what happened in the fermenter. This is that decrease that you saw. Now look at this, all this extra fermentation that happened within the bottle. It equaled an extra 10 grams per liter post-packaging. And that's going to equal a lot of CO2 in your bottle. And that was a total of 7 weeks at 35 degrees. And then it finally started to flatline at about 5 grams per liter. So what does this equal in terms of CO2 in your bottle? So it metabolized an extra, in the bottle, 10 grams per liter sugar, which is roughly 4.6 grams per liter CO2, which is an extra 2.3 volumes on top of your already existing 2.5 volumes. You're in the danger zone at about 4.8, which is well above most standard brewing bottles. Most bottles can handle up to 4 before you start getting into problems. And this is we already let it ferment this much for 20 days in the carboy before transferring it into the bottle.
Do you know what the gravities were at that point? Like, transferring?
It was at like 1.
Yeah, it would have been 1 Plato.
One Plato.
1 Plato.
Yeah, still pretty extra.
Yeah, sorry, you guys don't really, you don't have an HPLC, you don't know grams per liter. I can go back to this one.
That's the group by next year.
Right here. Oh, it's actually grams per liter too, sorry. So that is just in your standard Saison that you've allowed to ferment in the carboy. What happens if you do a batch of Saison and then a batch of English after, and you get some cross-contamination of your Saison strain into your English? It's your worst-case scenario. So you get all of the extra fermentation, all of that extra maltodextrin that the lazy English strain didn't consume, and you get an explosion. That's roughly 45 grams per liter, 20 grams per liter roughly of CO2, 10 volumes of CO2 on top of what you already had in the bottle. So someone's losing an eye.
That's an issue for a cake.
On top of just the extra CO2 and danger of that, a lot of these Saison and Diastaticus strains are POF positive, so they produce clove spice from decarboxylation of 4-frulic acid. So you'll get off flavors as well. So how do we prevent this from happening?
Acid rest? Or the last
Oh, the explosion.
No. Explosion. For PO.
So of course, avoid cross-contamination of Diastaticus strains. So in breweries, they do a lot of QA, QC now. They have a lot of selective medias that they look for, and they plate out all their gear. And you guys, probably a lot of people don't have home labs where you're doing a lot of plating. So just sanitize really well and pay attention to maybe what carboys you're using in a sequence of what strains. So maybe don't brew in English right after a Saison, or really make sure you're sanitizing. try and get as much of attenuation in the fermenter as you can. Obviously, this takes a lot of time, so try and speed it up. You can actually free rise your temperature. I don't know how much exothermic action you're going to get in a carboy. You probably get a little bit, but you can, after you get a lot of the bulk of the fermentation done, maybe you can move your fermenter into a warmer area, or if you have a means of heating or controlling your temperature, you can go a little warmer. There's a general principle in chemistry and enzyme chemistry. For every 10 degrees centigrade, you get roughly 2 or 3-fold increase in enzyme action. So you're going to speed things up by maybe 2 times. So instead of something taking 20 days at 20 degrees, if you let it go to 30 degrees, you're looking at a reasonable time. You can make your wort more fermentable. Scott specifically told me to put this on here, not less. So your initial inclination might be to mash at a higher temperature, but really what you're doing is creating more of those dextrins. You're creating more dextrin, so you're going to get more of this long, slow decrease that'll never end. If you make things more fermentable, you're going to be dropping your total dextrin down. It's going to be starting here, and you're going to have a higher proportion of these brewing sugars, and the slope will be a lot quicker. So mash for longer at a warmer temperature, or a more moderate temperature. If you have a friend that works at a brewery and they're doing any brute IPAs, you can try and score some glucoamylase from them. I don't know how easy this is to get from like homebrew shops. It's really easy to use.
They're selling it now because everyone wants to do brewed IPAs, I think. So
I got a couple of kilos.
Yeah, you got a bunch?
You would.
So you can do what the yeast is going to do and just add a bunch of purified glucoamylase. You can filter and pasteurize your beer. So filtration, it has to be very, very effective. People have done studies and shown that even 10,000 cells is enough to create a major problem, and you're still going to see your decrease. So if you do filtration, it has to be very effective. And I don't think too many people are going to be pasteurizing their beer, but unfortunately, pasteurization isn't very effective for the type of glucoamylase that Diastaticus makes. It's glycosylated, which the purified stuff you buy from that are made by bacteria are not. And the glycosylated version is actually much more thermotolerant. So you have to pasteurize at a much higher temperature for longer, and you just end up cooking your beer. The easiest thing is to fully attenuate in the fermenter as much as possible, and then cold crash and refrigerate your beer. So once it's carbonated, put it at 4 degrees. It's the opposite of letting it free rise. So if you're reducing the temperature, you're going to slow down all that enzyme activity. So instead of speeding it up by double, you're going to be reducing it by double. So it'll eventually explode. It'll just happen. It'll give you more time to drink the beer. So it's still a little risky, and it is time sensitive. And then you can also go with the bright solution, which we're developing yeast right now, where we're removing STA1 gene, and with it the possibility of the super attenuation, because we're removing the yeast's ability to make that enzyme. What we do is selective breeding, so it's fully non-GMO. It's what yeast naturally do in the wild. It's how you get new yeast. They can actually sexually mate just like us. So we put them in a special media that stresses the yeast out, and they form spores. We can then take a special microscope, and we take 2 of these yeast and put them beside each other, and if they're compatible, they'll actually mate.
Do you play Barry White?
Yes, we turned the lights down. It's actually Beyonce. So we can take a yeast with no enzyme activity, like an American ale strain or an English strain, and breed it to a Saison strain, and we get all of these daughter cells. Unfortunately, it's a dominant trait, so we have to, all the yeast, even if it has one copy of the gene, it'll still have the ability to make the enzyme. So what we have to do is check all the daughter cells and then remake them. And we continually keep back crossing until we find the perfect yeast that doesn't have the enzyme activity but still retains all the traits of the original Saison. So this is where we're at right now. We found one that doesn't consume any dextrins. This is the traditional brewing strain. You can see it going down. Our version doesn't consume any. However, it's still a very dry fermenter, so you're still going to get that really characteristic dry Saison. It's not going to be sweet like an English strain. It consumes all of the actual fermentable sweet sugars. It just doesn't start chewing into those dextrins. So it consumes all the fermentable sugars, and it also produces a lot of the aroma that you're looking for from a Saison. So it produces a higher level of fusel alcohols, esters, and phenolics. This is an example of a beer we brewed, and we did that forced attenuation test with it. After 60 days, our extract, our degree of Plato is still exactly the same, whereas the traditional Saison had gone down by like half a Plato. So it's still dry, it's spicy, produces lots of phenolics, lively, it still has the ability to do really nice bottle carbonation, so you get that nice lively mouthfeel. And it produces a really high level of ethyl esters associated with like stone fruit and citrus. And hopefully next time when we come back we have samples for you guys. It'll be active dry yeast again. But it's going to be going to our manufacturers soon for drying trials.
It's down in that range. Yeah, it's like the thermal tolerant. It's not thermal tolerant, right?
No, so no, it's a different. It's carbohydrate. So you're thinking of like protein rest.
Yeah.
That's a different enzyme. Those are proteases.
Okay.
This is for carbohydrates. It doesn't get discussed much because it is not thermotolerant at all. I'm actually not 100% sure at what time point it starts dying off, but I think it's in the 40s. So if you do a protein rest, you might be debranching, and it might be doing its job a little bit.
Okay.
Really want to have like the most beta amylase kind of enzyme action as possible in your mash.
Yeah, so beta amylase is the saccharification enzyme.
Yeah.
So for these, you really want to maximize beta amylase, which will make your wort more fermentable.
So like 64 degrees or so Celsius.
Yeah,
Like
you'll-
5 hours. For like 5 hours. They was thinking to have a long mash.
Like overnight.
You actually have to be careful because alpha amylase, if it works too much, it's almost counterintuitive. Beta amylase is actually, it's odd, and I'm not 100% sure, I'm not an enzyme scientist, and not 100% sure how it actually works.
You're not?
But it has an affinity for longer starches for whatever reason. So if you really work also the alpha amylase, you're going to create lots of little short chunks, and you're actually going to decrease the efficiency of beta amylase.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm not 100% sure why, but it prefers longer, bigger starches. It's more efficient that way.
Isn't it the temperature range that the enzyme runs in? So if you limit your
no.
beta, you're going more into your alpha because you're in a higher temperature range?
Well, they both work at a lower temperature. This beta will be deactivated at higher temperatures. But what I was saying is, at the temperature that beta amylase is working, alpha amylase is also doing its job. It's liquefying all the starches. And for whatever reason, the beta actually prefers to work on these big full units rather than these little short chunks. So it's almost like a race against the clock as well. Any other questions?
Enzyme. Sorry, Megan, not an enzyme scientist. When you denature it when you go high to a high enough temperature. If you drop the temperature back down, do they reactivate or are they done?
Unfortunately, they're done. Yeah.
Okay.
Once they're decoiled, they don't go back.
Okay. Perfect.
Once you mash out, that's it.
What's the fear with GMO?
There is no fear of GMO.
Okay.
So
It's a customer fear problem.
yeah, so the first evolution of strains we came out with technically were GMO. It was like 11 years ago when I first started, and we worked in the wine industry, and most winemakers and brewers are completely fine with GMOs as the customers. So then there started this big hysteria of GMO technology, and winemakers and brewers and people in the food industry took a step back because ultimately they're selling to a customer, that's what they're demanding. So we do everything non-GMO. We do it the hard and old-fashioned way. It does actually have some benefits because when you do a GMO technology, you can target one specific pathway, but what we're doing holistic approach where it's literally old-fashioned breeding, so you get kind of all the pathways and instead of just one specific thing. So
It's like more nuanced instead of being like.
yeah,
You're kind of breeding out instead of breeding.
exactly. Instead of just
Yeah.
doing one targeted. Sometimes when you do one targeted thing, when you focus just on one pathway, you can throw a lot of other things out of whack. But when you breed, it kind of all goes together. So a lot of times what you can do, and what's becoming really popular in the biotech industry right now, is people will make a GMO and target that one enzyme that they want to maximize or that one thermotolerance or something, but then they'll take it and optimize it via breeding to make it, just take it to that next level. So a lot of people are doing combined technologies like that. But I think you'll start seeing a lot more, hopefully, GMO stuff going forward. But we do have some GMO technologies more in the biofuels and biotech industry.
Less
But-
consumption by humans and
Yeah,
more consumption by humans.
anything that we have in the food industry or fermentation beverages, we do it all non-GMO.
Are there cases when like that hyper-attenuation is desirable? Like brewers can use it to get higher alcohol and more product out of less?
Yeah, so you see it a lot in biofuels and distilleries. A lot of distiller strains have this activity. I don't know how much you actually end up getting in a distillery because you do really hot, fast fermentations, like 48 hours, 36 hours. So I don't know how much of that enzyme has actually been able to be turned on because it sees all those simple brewing sugars that it loves to take up and doesn't need to make the enzyme. So it's probably near the end when the distiller is getting ready to actually move it over and distill that the enzyme starts getting turned on. So they do have it, but I don't know how much it actually makes a difference.
Yeah, I use distilled yeast for things, and yeah, this actually explains the behavior a great deal. Like, and this actually makes total sense now. What some of the stuff I've seen in my own, I had no idea what was going on. So thank you.
Glucoamylase.
Yeah.
When you mentioned there was lawsuits early in the presentation, I've heard a little bit about it, but it's somewhat of an interesting story, I think. That's with Left Hand and but maybe you could speak to that, or someone else can fill everybody in.
It's probably not my place to talk.
Fair, yeah.
But if you get, it's easily Googleable. It's a $6 million lawsuit that's going on right now. I would say supposedly, and nothing's been proved in the court of law, allegedly,
Yes.
that White Labs sold contaminated, like an American brewing strain or just a regular brewing strain that was contaminated with Diastaticus. And Left Hand Brewing, unfortunately, put it in their milk stout, which is
Kablooey.
Will it ferment lactose too?
I don't think so. I'm not 100% sure. Actually, I
We
don't
won't
know.
see you there.
That's just because there's a lot of dextrose in it?
I don't think it does actually, no. I'm pretty sure it doesn't.
bond, right?
Yeah, I don't think it's, I'm almost 100% sure it doesn't have the capability of doing that.
Yeah.
But it probably would have had a lot of maltotriose and a lot of dextrin to create that body. And kablamo.
You probably don't want much phenols in it.
You don't always get, if you get cross-contamination with Diastaticus, you don't always get the POF character, or the phenolic off flavor, because you only require, like I said, like 10,000 cells for it to create this problem. And 10,000 cells, you're probably not going to notice a lot of the flavor aroma from it, but you will notice the fermentation.
You mentioned cross-contamination and the importance of things. Is Bright going to be producing a line of cleaners and sanitizers?
No, sorry, I'm not a chemical scientist either.
What is the, traditionally we use a Brett to do a lot of the stuff, to like dry out beers and traditionally we use Brett to do a lot of the stuff.
Yep.
So does Brett kind of behave the same way as Diastaticus?
Yes, it does. So they both contain the ability to produce glucoamylase.
Okay.
They are different species. So Saccharomyces Cerevisiae subspecies Diastaticus, and then Brett is Brett's a completely different strain,
Yeah.
but they both produce glucoamylase.
So with different flavor benefits or losses.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you wanted to prevent your beer from being infected by Brett, use glucoamylase in your mash. By the way, 225 mils, $21.95. Typical dosage, 0.36 mil per pound of starches in
Hey.
very economic.
From who? From who?
Oh, from Fraser Mills.
5% off to the Canadian.
No discounts for you.
Do I get like a cut of this, or?
Is there a shelf life?
Yeah.
Is there a shelf life on that tin? For glucoamylase?
If you keep it chilled, it's long.
Okay.
Long. Unlike some things about you.
There's no other questions?
Sorry, could you go back to the slide about the variety of strain that you're working on producing that's to, I'm just trying to understand, combat Diastaticus? Or?
Yeah, so we took a Saison, a traditional Saison yeast that has the enzyme activity, which is this plus sign, and we mated it to a strain that doesn't have the enzyme activity. We get a variety of daughter cells that do or don't have the enzyme activity. We then make beer, which is Scott's job, with thousands of these little yeast. We isolate a single one, make beer with them, and then we do chemistry on it, see which ones are consuming dextrose or dextrins, which ones aren't. Some of them lose the capability of consuming maltotriose, which is, we definitely don't want that. We want it to be nice and dry. So we screen all of these daughter cells and look for the one that has all the characteristics that we want. So no dextrin induction, all the dry brewing sugars, POF positive, so you get that nice phenolics, and then also nice and fruity.
Yeah.
So we get to taste all these beers too, and make sure that they have the proper brewing, or the proper aroma as well.
Very cool.
So are you ever using wild yeast strains, or are you mostly going for ones that are already established as Cerevisiae and then trying to modify them? Or?
Sure. So there's two definitions of wild yeast. Most yeast manufacturers, when they talk about wild yeast, they're talking about any variety that's different than the one indicated on the package. So technically, even if you have like a wine strain that's that got contaminated into a brewing strain, it's a wild yeast because it's not the one that's intended to be there. The other definition is anything that's not Saccharomyces Cerevisiae. We don't really work with anything that's non-sac right now. We do work with some like wild strains. So I don't know if anyone's brewed with Sac Trois. Technically, it's a wild strain because it's not like a traditional brewing strain. Sac Trois is Diastaticus. So I don't know if anyone's made any IPAs or anything with it. It just kind of keep fermenting forever. But it's a really unique example of a Diastaticus that's not POF positive. It's very clean. It's really fruity, but it's clean. So it's unique in that respect. But we don't do any like Brett or anything like that.
Is cuvee yeast Diastaticus?
They can and can't be. So most Kveik cultures are a mishmash of like 30, 40 different yeast. It's like a symbiotic relationship, almost like, well, kombucha is bacteria and wild yeast and different things, but a lot of Kveik yeast, unless it's been taken by like a white lab or Y yeast and they purified and found one. We're doing that in our lab right now because it is like a wealth of biodiversity. And we're finding some are PUF positive, some are PUF negative, some have STA1, some don't. So it really depends on if you're buying a purified culture or if you got it from a friend and they got it from someone in Norway. If you got it like straight from a farmhouse, it's probably just a mishmash and it's got a little bit of everything.
Nice.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.